on the development of intelligence. Tests of infant intelligence are less verbal, obviously, because they can't speak. They contain elements related to perceptual motor development and social interaction. A guy named Arnold Gesell in 1934 developed a measure that helped to sort out what they call typically developing from atypical developing babies. The current version of the Gesell tests has 4 different categories. So you have motor, language, adaptive, and personal social. They have what they call the development quotient, DQ is what they call it, and it combines the subscores in these categories to provide an overall score, kind of like the IQ tests. Another widely used one is the Bailey 3 scales of infant development, and they assess behavior and predict later development. The current version has 5 different scales: the cognitive, language, motor, social, emotional, and adaptive. And several studies have found that measures of intelligence in infancy are correlated with measures of intelligence later in childhood. Some important changes in cognitive development occur after infancy, however, obviously. The idea of stability and change in intelligence. Your scores on intelligence tests can fluctuate dramatically throughout the childhood years. They're going to be highly correlated at some areas. So your IQ or DQ at 1 is going to be highly correlated to your IQ at age 2. There's going to be a fairly strong correlation between it early on and in preschool, and then it's going to be a fairly high correlation between infancy and adolescence. That being said, children are adaptive and their intelligence does change, but it remains connected to earlier points in development. And I think I maybe talked about this in one of the earlier lectures, the idea that your genes are going to provide a range for your IQ. So maybe your genes would be able to predict that your IQ would be 120 to 150. Let's say it's there, 120 to 150. And then your environment and your experiences are going to help you to hone in on where you're going to land. So if you have a good schools, good home environment, you're going to land closer to that 150, potentially. If you don't have great schools, if your parents maybe are a little bit neglective, maybe you're going to land closer to that 120. So again, it's a range, and your scores are going to be connected throughout the lifespan. But again, you are adaptive and you are going to change depending upon your environment. Related to this is the ideas of intellectual disability and giftedness. These are the extremes of intelligence. For intellectual disability, this is going to be a condition of limited mental ability in which the individual has either a low IQ, this is usually going to be below 70 on a traditional IQ test, maybe has difficulty adapting to everyday life, and first exhibits these characteristics by the age of 18. The book talks about a couple different ways to organize disabilities. So there's the organic intellectual disability. This is going to be a genetic disorder or lower intelligence due to brain damage. This could be Down syndrome, abnormality of the X chromosome, prenatal malformations, metabolic disorders, and even brain diseases. For those, the organic intellectual disabilities, most are going to have IQs between 0 and 50. On the cultural familial intellectual disability, these are going to be cases where there's no evidence of organic brain damage. Often emerge from below average intellectual environments, and most have IQs between 55 and 70. This disability is usually not as noticeable until you get into adulthood. On the other end is going to be giftedness, and so these are going to be people that have a high intelligence or superior talent of some kind. An IQ of 130 is usually considered the low threshold. Approximately 3 to 5 U.S. students are considered gifted, and these estimates focus on children who are gifted intellectually and academically, maybe not necessarily in things like music or art. So yes, they often fail to include those who are gifted in creative thinking and visual arts and performing arts. Just kind of as a side note, sometimes you might hear that people that have these really high IQs, genius level IQs, that they have different maybe mental health issues. In general, there is no connection between giftedness and mental disorders to be found. There are 3 criteria that categorize gifted children. The first one, precociousness, the idea that they master things earlier than other kids. So for example, if you have a kid that's able to draw really well and they're only like 3 years of age, that could be this idea that they have some precociousness in that area. So they're mastering it earlier. The second one is marching to their own drummer. Essentially, they need minimal help to get things done. They need minimal scaffolding, like we talked about in some earlier chapters. They actually resist explicit instruction. They don't want you to tell them how to do it. They want to figure it out on their own. And the third one is a passion to master. They don't need to be pushed. They have an intense, obsessive interest in whatever their area is that they are gifted in. Giftedness is both about heredity and environment, obviously, and individuals that are gifted often demonstrate these special abilities from an early age, even before they begin training in that area. Individuals with world-class status in their gifted domain all report strong family support and years of training and practice. So the family is very supportive of them in whatever field that they are gifted in. Highly gifted individuals are typically not gifted in many domains. One of the examples is from the textbook is Bill Gates. He is gifted in one very specific area. He's not a genius in all areas. Usually this giftedness is going to emerge in childhood. It's possible that gifted children that are insufficiently challenged can become disruptive, maybe skip classes, lose interest. It's possible for their schooling, but for their area of interest, again, they're going to have that passion to master, and so they're definitely going to be highly invested in that one area. But as far as school goes, for the gifted, some that are of very high intelligence, they can become socially isolated and they can feel under-challenged by their schoolwork. And the last thing we'll talk about that's related to these are the idea of creativity. So creativity, the definition from the textbook, is the ability to think about something in a novel or unusual way and come up with unique solutions. Intelligence and creativity are not the same thing. Creativity requires what they call divergent thinking, which produces many answers to the same questions. An example of a divergent thinking type question will be if you show a kid a newspaper and say, how many uses can you come up with for this newspaper? So that's going to entail using divergent thinking, coming up with many different possible solutions. Conventional intelligence tests, though, they measure convergent thinking, where there's only one correct answer. Again, multiple choice tests, essentially. According to the textbook, so last chapter we talked about critical thinking. The textbook said that it is on the decline. In this chapter, we talked about creative thinking, and that according to the text, it appears to be declining as well. And what they guess is the reason for this is what many of you talked about in the decline of critical thinking. Among the likely causes in the U.S. are the numbers of hours spent watching TV, engaging with social media, and playing video games. And then also that there's going to be a lack of emphasis on creative thinking in schools. Not all schools. So some people, if they come from great schools, there's going to be classes that are going to try to enhance this creative thinking, or maybe if you're in a Montessori school, something of this nature. But in a lot of schools, they need to meet the benchmarks. They need to get these test scores, and so they need to get you thinking in a convergent way, and they need you to be able to answer multiple choice tests correctly so that they can get ranked where they need to get ranked, so they can get the funding that they need to get. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in one of the later chapters, the idea of schooling. All right, that's it for Chapter 8. Thank you very much for listening.